Charles-Édouard Jeanneret, born the 6th of October, 1887, also known as Le Corbusier, was a Swiss-French architect, designer, painter, urban planner, and writer who was one of the pioneers of what is now regarded as modern architecture. He was born in Switzerland to French-speaking Swiss parents and acquired French nationality by naturalization on the 19th of September in 1930. His career spanned 5 decades in which he designed buildings in Europe, Japan, India, as well as North and South America. He considered that, dedicated to providing better living conditions for the residents of crowded cities, Le Corbusier was influential in urban planning and was a founding member of the Congrès International d'Architecture Moderne. Le Corbusier prepared the master plan for the city of Chandigarh in India and contributed specific designs for several buildings there, especially the government buildings. On July 17th of 2016, 17 projects by Le Corbusier in 7 countries were inscribed in the list of UNESCO World Heritage Sites as the architectural work of Le Corbusier, an outstanding contribution to the modern movement. Le Corbusier remains a controversial figure. Some of his urban planning ideas have been criticized for their indifference to pre-existing cultural sites, societal expression, and equality, and his alleged ties with fascism, anti-Semitism, eugenics, and the dictator Benito Mussolini have resulted in some continuing contention. Le Corbusier also designed well-known furniture such as the LC4 Chase lounge chair and the LC1 chair, both made of leather with metal framing. Early life, 1887 through 1904. Charles-Édouard Jeanneret was born on the 6th of October, 1887, in La Chaux-de-Fonds, a city in the Neuchâtel region in the Romandie region of Switzerland. His ancestors included Belgians with the surname Le Corbusier, which inspired the pseudonym Le Corbusier, which he would adopt as an adult. His father was an artisan who enameled boxes and watches, and his mother taught piano. His elder brother, Albert, was an amateur violinist. La Chaux-de-Fonds was a burgeoning city at the heart of the Watch Valley. Its culture was influenced by the Loge Limite, a Masonic lodge upholding moral, social, and philosophical ideas symbolized by the right angle, rectitude, and the compass, exactitude. Le Corbusier would later describe these as my guide, my choice, and as time-honored ideas ingrained and deep-rooted in the intellect, like entries from a catechism. Like his contemporaries, Frank Lloyd Wright and Mies van der Rohe, Le Corbusier lacked formal training as an architect. He was attracted to the visual arts. At the age of 15, he entered the Municipal Art School in La Chaux-de-Fonds, which taught the applied arts connected with watchmaking. 3 years later, he attended the higher course of decoration founded by the painter Charles Le Platinier, who had studied in Budapest and Paris. Le Corbusier wrote later that Le Platinier had made him a man of the woods and taught him about painting from nature. His father frequently took him into the mountains around the town. He wrote later, "We were constantly on the mountaintops. We grew accustomed to a vast horizon." His architecture teacher in the art school was architect René Chapoise, who had a large influence on Le Corbusier's earliest house designs. He reported later that it was the art teacher, Le Platinier, who made him choose architecture. "I had a horror of architecture and architects," he wrote. "I was 16. I accepted the verdict, and I obeyed. I moved into architecture." Le Corbusier began teaching himself by going to the library to read about architecture and philosophy, visiting museums, sketching buildings, and constructing them. In 1905, he and 2 other students, under the supervision of their teacher, René Chapoise, designed and built his first house, the Villa Follette, for the engraver Louis Follette, a friend of his teacher, Charles Leplantier. Located on the forested hillside near Chaux-de-Fonds, it was a large chalet with a step roof in the local Alpine style and carefully colored geometric patterns on the facade. The successes of this house led to his construction of 2 similar houses, the Villas Jacomet and Stotzer, in the same area. In September 1907, he made his first trip outside of Switzerland, going to Italy, then that winter traveling through Budapest to Vienna, where he stayed for 4 months and met Gustav Klimt and tried, without success, to meet Joseph Hoffmann. In Florence, he visited Florence Charter House in Galuzzo, which made a lifelong impression on him. "I would have liked to live in one of what they called their cells, he later wrote. It was the solution for a unique kind of workers' housing, or rather, for a terrestrial paradise. He traveled to Paris, and for 14 months between 1908 and 1910, he worked as a draftsman in the office of architect Auguste Perret, the pioneer of the use of reinforced concrete in residential construction and the architect of the Art Deco landmark Theatre des Champs-Élysées. 2 years later, between October 1910 and March 1911, he traveled to Germany and worked for 4 months in the office of Peter Behrens, where Mies van der Rohe and Walter Gropius were also working and learning. In 1911, he traveled again with his friend August Klipstein for 5 months. This time, he journeyed to the Balkans and visited Serbia, Bulgaria, Turkey, Greece, as well as Pompeii and Rome, filling nearly 80 sketchbooks with renderings of what he saw, including many sketches of the Parthenon, whose forms he would later praise in his work Vers une Architecture. He spoke of what he saw during his trip in many of his books, and it was the subject of his last book, Le Voyage d'Orient. In 1912, he began his most ambitious project, a new house for his parents, also located on the forested hillside near La Chaux-de-Fonds. The Jeanneret-Perret house was larger than the others and in a more innovative style. The horizontal plains contrasted dramatically with the steep alpine slopes, and the white walls and lack of decoration were in sharp contrast with the other buildings on the hillside. The interior spaces were organized around the 4 pillars of the salon in the center, foretelling the open interiors he would create in his later buildings. The project was more expensive to build than he imagined. His parents were forced to move from the house within 10 years and relocate to a more modest house. However, it led to a commission to build an even more imposing villa in the nearby village of La Locle for a wealthy watch manufacturer, Georges Fabre-Jacquot. Le Corbusier designed the new house in less than a month. The building was carefully designed to fit its hillside site, and the interior plan was spacious and designed around a courtyard for maximum light, a significant departure from the traditional houses, Domino House and Schwab House, 1914 through 1918. During World War I, Le Corbusier taught at a school in La Chaux-de-Fonds. He concentrated on theoretical architecture studies using modern techniques. In December 1914, along with the engineer Max Dubois, he began a serious study of the use of reinforced concrete as a building material. He had first discovered concrete working in the office of Auguste Perret, the pioneer of reinforced concrete architecture in Paris, but now wanted to use it in new ways. Reinforced concrete provided me with incredible resources, he wrote later, and variety and a passionate plasticity in which, by themselves, my structures will be the rhythm of a palace and a Pompeian tranquility. This led him to his plan for the Domino House in 1914. This model proposed an open floor plan consisting of 3 concrete slabs supported by 6 thin reinforced concrete columns, with a stairway providing access to each level on one side of the floor plan. The system was originally designed to provide large numbers of temporary residencies after World War I, producing only slabs, columns, and stairways, and residents could build exterior walls with the materials around the site. He described it in his patent application as a juxtaposable system of construction according to an infinite number of combinations of plans. This would permit, he wrote, the construction of the dividing walls at any point of the facade on the interior. Under this system, the structure of the house did not have to appear on the outside, but could be hidden behind a glass wall, and the interior could be arranged in a way that the architect liked. After it was patented, Le Corbusier designed several houses according to the system, which was all white concrete boxes. Although some of these were never built, they illustrated his basic architectural ideas, which would dominate his works throughout the 1920s. He refined the idea in his 1927 book on the 5 points of a new architecture. This design, which called for the disassociation of the structure from the walls and the freedom of plans and facades, became the foundation for most of his architecture over the next 10 years. In August 1916, Le Corbusier received his largest commission ever, to construct a villa for the Swiss watchmaker Anatole Schwab, for whom he had already completed several small remodeling projects. He was given a large budget and the freedom to design not only the house, but also create the interior decoration and choose the furniture. Following the precepts of Auguste Perret, he built the structure out of reinforced concrete and filled the gaps with brick. The center of the house is a large concrete box with two semi-column structures on both sides, which reflects his ideas of pure geometrical forms. A large open hall with a chandelier occupied the center of the building. You can see, he wrote to Auguste Perret in July 1916, that Auguste Perret left more in me than Peter Behrens. Le Corbusier's grand ambitions collided with the ideas and budget of his client and led to bitter conflicts. Schwab went to court and denied Le Corbusier access to the site or the right to claim to be the architect. Le Corbusier responded, "Whether you like it or not, my presence is inscribed in every corner of your house." Le Corbusier took great pride in the house and reproduced pictures in several of his books: Painting, Cubism, Purism, and L'Esprit Nouveau, 1918 through 1922. Le Corbusier moved to Paris definitively in 1917 and began his architectural practice with his cousin Pierre Jeanneret, a partnership that would last until the 1950s, with an interruption in the World War II years. In 1918, Le Corbusier met the Cubist painter Amédée Ozenfant, in whom he recognized a kindred spirit. Ozenfant encouraged him to paint, and the two began a period of collaboration. Rejecting Cubism as irrational and romantic, the pair jointly published their manifesto Après le Cubisme and established a new artistic movement, Purism. Ozenfant and Le Corbusier began writing for a new journal, L'Esprit Nouveau, and prompted with energy and imagination his ideas of architecture. In the first issue of the journal, in 1920, Charles-Édouard Jeanneret adopted Le Corbusier, an altered form of his maternal grandfather's name, as a pseudonym, reflecting his belief that anyone could reinvent themselves. Adopting a single name to identify oneself was in vogue by artists in many fields during that era, especially in Paris. Between 1918 and 1922, Le Corbusier did not build anything, concentrating his efforts on purist theory and painting. In 1922, he and his cousin Pierre Jeanneret opened a studio in Paris at 35 Rue de Sèvres. They set up an architectural practice together. From 1927 to 1937, they worked together in Charlotte, Perriand, at the Le Corbusier Pierre Jeanneret studio. In 1929, the trio prepared the house fitting section for Decorative Artists exhibition and asked for a group stand, renewing and widening the 1928 avant-garde group idea. This was refused by the Decorative Artists Committee. They resigned and founded the Union of Modern Artists. His theoretical studies soon advanced into several different single-family house models. Among these was the Maison Citroën. The project's name was a reference to the French Citroën automaker. For the modern industrial methods and materials Le Corbusier advocated using in the house's construction, as well as he intended the homes would be consumed, similar to other commercial products like the automobile. As a part of the Maison Citroën model, Le Corbusier proposed a 3-floor structure with a double-height living room, bedrooms on the second floor, and a kitchen on the third floor. The roof would be occupied by a sun terrace. On the exterior, Le Corbusier installed a stairway to provide second-floor access from the ground level. Here, as in other projects from this period, he also designed the facades to include large, uninterrupted banks of windows. The house used a rectangular plan with exterior walls that were not filled by windows, but left as white, stuccoed spaces. Le Corbusier and Jeanneret left the interior aesthetically spare, with any movable furniture made of tubular metal frames. Light fixtures usually comprised single, bare bulbs. Interior walls were also left white. Toward an architecture, 1920 through 1923. In 1922 and 1923, Le Corbusier devoted himself to advocating his new concepts of architecture and urban planning in a series of polemical articles published in L'Esprit Nouveau. At the Paris Salon d'Automne in 1922, he presented his plan for the Villa Contemporaine, a model city for 3 million people, whose residents would live and work in a group of identical 60-story tall apartment buildings surrounded by lower zigzag apartment blocks in a large park. In 1923, he collected his essays from L'Esprit Nouveau, published in his first and most influential book, Towards an Architecture. He presented his idea for the future of architecture in a series of maxims, declarations, and exhortations, pronouncing that a grand epoch has just begun. There exists a new spirit. There already exists a crowd of works in the new spirit. They are found especially in industrial production. Architecture is suffocating in its current uses. Styles are a lie. Style is a unity of principles which animates all the work of a period and which result in characteristic spirit. Our epoch determines each day its style. Our eyes unfortunately don't know how to see it yet, and his most famous maxim, a house is a machine to live in. Most of the many photographs and drawings in the book came from outside of the world of traditional architecture. The cover showed a promenade deck of an ocean liner, while others showed racing cars, aeroplanes, factories, and the huge concrete and steel arches of Zeppelin hangars. L'Esprit Nouveau Pavilion, 1925. An important early work of Le Corbusier was the Esprit Nouveau Pavilion, built for the 1925 International Exhibition of Modern Decorative and Industrial Arts, the event which later gave Art Deco its name. Le Corbusier built the pavilion in collaboration with Amédée Ozenfant and his cousin Pierre Jeanneret. Le Corbusier and Ozenfant had broken with Cubism and formed the Purism movement in 1918, and in 1920 founded their journal L'Esprit Nouveau. In his new journal, Le Corbusier vividly denounced the decorative arts. Decorative art, as opposed to the machine phenomenon, is the final twitch of the old manual modes, a dying thing. To illustrate his ideas, he and Ozenfant decided to create a small pavilion at the exposition representing his idea of the future urban housing unit. A house, he wrote, is a cell within the body of a city. The cell is made up of the vital elements which are the mechanics of a house. Decorative art is anti-standardizational. Our pavilion will contain only standard things created by industry and factories and mass-produced, objects truly of the style today. My pavilion will therefore be a cell extracted from a huge apartment building. Le Corbusier and his collaborators were given a plot of land located behind the Grand Palace in the center of the exposition. The plot was forested and the exhibitors could not cut down the trees, so Le Corbusier built his pavilion with a tree in the center, emerging through a hole in the roof. The building was a stark white box with an interior terrace and square glass windows. The interior was decorated with a few Cubist paintings and a few pieces of mass-produced, commercially available furniture, entirely different from the expensive one-of-a-kind pieces in other pavilions. The chief organizers of the exposition were furious and built a fence to partially hide the pavilion. Le Corbusier had to appeal to the Ministry of Fine Arts, which ordered that the fence be taken down. Besides the furniture, the pavilion exhibited a model of his Plan Voisin, his proactive plan for rebuilding a large part of the center of Paris. He proposed to bulldoze a large area north of the Seine and replace the narrow streets and monuments and houses with giant 60-story cruciform towers placed with an orthogonal street grid and park-like green space. His scheme was met with criticism and scorn from French politicians and industrialists, although they were favorable to the ideas of Taylorism and Fordism underlying his designs. The plan was never seriously considered, but it provoked discussion concerning how to deal with the overcrowded, poor working-class neighborhoods of Paris, and it later saw the partial realization in the housing developments built in Paris suburbs from the 1950s through the 1960s. The pavilion was ridiculed by many critics, but Le Corbusier, undaunted, wrote, "Right now, one thing is sure. 1925 marks the decisive turning point in the quarrel between the old and new. After 1925, the antique lovers will have virtually ended their lives. Progress is achieved through experimentation. The decision will be awarded on the field of battle of the new, the decorative arts of today, 1925. In 1925, Le Corbusier combined a series of articles about decorative art form L'Esprit Nouveau into a book, L'Art Décoratif d'aujourd'hui, the decorative art of today. The book was a spirited attack on the very idea of decorative art. His basic premise, repeated throughout the book, was modern decorative art has no decoration. He attacked with enthusiasm the styles presented at the 1925 Exposition of Decorative Arts. The desire to decorate everything about one is a false spirit and an abominable small perversion. The religion of beautiful materials is in its final death agony. The almost hysterical onrush of recent years towards the quasi-orgy of decor is only the last spasm of a death already predictable. He cited in the 1912 book of the Austrian architect Adolf Loos, Ornament and Crime, and quoted Loos' dictum, "The more a people are cultivated, the more decor disappears." He attacked the Deco revival of classical styles, what he called Louis Philippe and Louis XVI. He condemned the symphony of color at the exposition and called it the triumph of assemblers of colors and materials. They were swaggering in colors. They were making stews out of fine cuisine. He condemned the exotic styles presented at the exposition based on the art of China, Japan, India, and Persia. It takes energy today to affirm our Western styles. He criticized the precious and useless objects that accumulated on the shelves in the new style. He attacked the rusting silks, the marbles, which twist and turn, the vermilion whiplashes, the silver blades of Byzantium, and the Orient. Let's be done with it. Why call bottles, chairs, baskets, and objects decorative? Le Corbusier act. They are useful tools. The decor is not necessary. Art is necessary. He declared that in the future, the decorative arts industry would produce only objects which are perfectly useful, convenient, and have a true luxury which pleases our spirit by their elegance and the purity of their execution and the efficiency of their services. This rational perfection and precise determinate creates the link sufficient to recognize a style. He described the future of decoration in these terms. The idea is to go work in the superb office, a modern factory, rectangular and well lit, painted in white Ripolin, a major French paint manufacturer, where healthy activity and laborious optimism reign. He concluded by repeating, "Modern decoration has no decoration." The book became a manifesto for those who opposed the more traditional styles of decorative arts. In the 1930s, as Le Corbusier predicted, the modernized versions of Louis Philippe and Louis XVI furniture and the brightly colored wallpapers of stylized roses were replaced by a more sober, more streamlined style. Gradually, the modernism and functionality proposed by Le Corbusier overtook the more ornamental style. The shorthand titles that Le Corbusier used in his book, 1925 Expo, Arts Deco, were adapted in 1966 by art historian Bevis Hillier for a catalog of an exhibition on the style, and in 1968 in the title of a book, Art Deco of the 20s and 30s. And thereafter the term Art Deco was commonly used as the name of the style. The notoriety that Le Corbusier achieved from his writings in the pavilion at the 1925 exposition led to commissions to build a dozen residencies in Paris, in the Paris regions in his purest style. These included the Maison La Roche, Albert Jeanneret, 1923 through 1925, which now houses the Fondation Le Corbusier, the Maison Gilliette, and Antwerp, Belgium. A residence for Jacques Lipchitz, the Mason Cook, and the Maison Planex. In 1927, he was invited by German Werkbund to build 3 houses in the model city of Weisenhof near Stuttgart, based on the Citroën house and other theoretical models he had published. He described this project in detail in one of his best-known essays, 5 Points of Architecture. The following year, he began the Villa Savoia, which became one of the most famous of Le Corbusier's work, and an icon of modernist architecture. Located in Poissy in a landscape surrounded by trees and a large lawn, the The house is an elegant white box poised on rows of slender pylons, surrounded by a horizontal band of windows which fill the structure with light. The service areas, parking, rooms for servants, and laundry room are located under the house. Visitors enter a vestibule from which a gentle ramp leads to the house. The bedrooms and salons of the house are distributed around a suspended garden. The room looks both out at the landscape and into the garden, which provides additional light and air. Another ramp leads up to the roof, and a stairway leads down to the cellar under the pillars. Villa Savoye succinctly summed up the 5 points of architecture that he had elucidated in L'Esprit Nouveau and the book Vers une Architecture, which he had been developing throughout the 1920s. First, Le Corbusier lifted the bulk of the structure off the ground, supporting it by pilotis, reinforced concrete stilts. These pilotis, in providing structural support for the house, allowed him to elucidate his next 2 points: a free facade, meaning non-supporting walls that he designed as the architect wished, and an open floor plan, meaning that the floor space was free to be configured into rooms without concern for supporting walls. The second floor of the Villa Savoye includes long strips of ribbon windows that allow unencumbered views of the large surrounding garden, which constitute the 4th point of his system. The 5th point was the roof garden to compensate for the green area consumed by the building and replace it on the roof. A ramp rising from ground level to the 3rd floor roof terrace allows for a promenade architecturale throughout the structure. The white tubular railing recalls the industrial ocean liner aesthetic that Le Corbusier much admired. Le Corbusier was quite rhapsodic when describing the house precisions in 1930. The plan is pure, exactly made for the needs of the house. It has its correct place in the rustic landscape of Poissy. It is poetry and lyricism supported by technique. The house had its problems. The roof persistently leaked due to construction faults, but it became a landmark of modern architecture and one of the best-known works of Le Corbusier. League of Nations competition and Pessac housing project, thanks to his passionate articles in L'Esprit Nouveau, his participation in the 1925 Decorative Arts Exhibition and the conferences he gave on the new spirit of architecture, Le Corbusier had become well known in the architectural world, though he had only built residencies for wealthy clients. In 1926, he entered the competition for the construction of a headquarters of the League of Nations in Geneva, with a plan for an innovative lakeside complex of modernist white concrete buildings and meeting halls. There were 337 projects in competition. It appeared that Corbusier's project was the first choice of the architectural jury, but after much behind-the-scenes maneuvering, the jury declared it was unable to pick a single winner, and the project was given instead to the top 5 architects, who were all neoclassicists. Le Corbusier was not discouraged. He presented his plan to the public in articles and lectures to show the opportunity that the League of Nations had missed. The City Fruges. In 1926, Le Corbusier received the opportunity he had been looking for. He was commissioned by a Bordeaux industrialist, Henry Fruges, a fervent admirer of his ideas on urban planning, to build a complex of worker housing, City Fruges, at Pessac, a suburb of Bordeaux. Le Corbusier described Pessac as a little like a Baltic novel, a chance to create a whole community for living and working. The Fruges Quarter became his laboratory for residential housing, a series of rectangular blocks composed of modular housing units located in a garden setting. Like the unit displayed at the 1925 exposition, each housing unit had its own small terrace. The earlier villas he constructed all had white exterior walls, but for Pessac, at the request of his clients, he added color, panels of brown, yellow, and jade green, coordinated by Le Corbusier. Originally planned to have some 200 units, it finally contained about 50 to 70 housing units in 8 buildings. Pessac became the model on a small scale for his later and much larger City Radius projects. Founding of CIAM 1928 and Athens Charter. In 1928, Le Corbusier took a major step towards establishing modernist architecture as the dominant European style. Le Corbusier had met with many of the leading German and Austrian modernists during the competition of the League of Nations in 1927. In the same year, the German Werkbund organized an architectural exposition at the Wiesnorf Estate, Stuttgart. 17 leading modernist architects in Europe were invited to design 21 houses. Le Corbusier and Mies van der Rohe played a major part. In 1927, Le Corbusier, Pierre Chareau, and others proposed the foundation of an international conference to establish the basis for a common style. The first meeting of the Congrès International d'Architecture Moderne, or International Congress of Modernist Architects, CIAM, was held in a chateau on Lake Léman in Switzerland on June 26 through June 28 of 1928. Those attending included Le Corbusier, Robert Millet-Stevens, Auguste Perret, Pierre Chareau, and Tony Garnier from France, Victor Bourgeois from Belgium, Walter Gropius, Eric Mendelssohn, Ernst May, and Mies van der Rohe from Germany, Joseph Frank from Austria, Mart Stam and Gerrit Rietveld from the Netherlands, and Adolf Loos from Czechoslovakia. A delegation of Soviet architects was invited to attend, but they were unable to obtain visas. Later members included Josep Louis Sert of Spain and Alvar Aalto of Finland. No one attended from the United States. A second meeting was organized in 1930 in Brussels by Victor Bourgeois on the topic Rational Methods for Groups of Habitations. A third meeting on the functional city was scheduled for Moscow in 1932, but was canceled at the last minute. Instead, the delegates held their meeting on a cruise ship traveling between Marseille and Athens. On board, together, they drafted a text on how modern cities should be organized. The text, called the Athens Charter, after considerable editing by Le Corbusier and others, was finally published in 1943 and became an influential text for city planners in the 1950s and 1960s. The group met once more in Paris in 1937 to discuss public housing and was scheduled to meet in the United States in 1939. But the meeting was canceled because of the war. The legacy of the CIAM was a roughly common style in doctrine which helped define modern architecture in Europe and the United States after World War II. Projects, 1928 through 1963. Moscow projects. Le Corbusier saw the new society founded in the Soviet Union after the Russian Revolution as a promising laboratory for his architectural ideas. He met the Russian architect Konstantin Melenkov during the 1925 Decorative Arts Exposition in Paris and admired the construction of Melnikov's constructivist USSR pavilion, the only truly modernist building in the exposition other than his own Esprit Nouveau pavilion. At Melnikov's invitation, he traveled to Moscow, where he found that his writings had been published in Russian. He gave lectures and interviews, and between 1928 and 1932, he constructed an office building for the Centro-Soyuz, the headquarters of Soviet Trade Union. In 1932, he was invited to take part in an international competition for the new Palace of the Soviets in Moscow, which was to be built on the site of the Cathedral of Christ the Savior, demolished on Stalin's orders. Le Corbusier contributed a highly original plan, a low-level complex of circular and rectangular buildings, and a rainbow-like arch from which the roof of the main meeting hall was suspended. To Le Corbusier's distress, his plan was rejected by Stalin in favor of a plan for a massive neoclassical tower, the highest in Europe, crowned with a statue of Vladimir Lenin. The palace was never built. Construction was stopped by World War II. A swimming pool took its place, and after the collapse of the USSR, the cathedral was rebuilt on its original site. Cité Universitaire, Immeuble Clarté, and Cité de Refuge, 1928 through 1933. Between 1928 and 1934, as Le Corbusier's reputation grew, he received commissions to construct a wide variety of buildings. In 1928, he received a commission from the Soviet government to construct the headquarters of the Tsetsaruz, or Central Office, or Trade Unions, a large office building whose glass walls alternated with plaques of stone. He built the Villa de Medro in La Pradette, 1929 through 1931, and an apartment in Paris for Charles de Bestigueux at the top of an existing building on the Champs-Élysées, 1929 through 1932, later demolished. In 1929 through 1930, he constructed a floating homeless shelter for the Salvation Army on the left bank of the Seine at the Pont d'Austerlitz. Between 1929 and 1933, he built a larger and more ambitious project for the Salvation Army, the City de Refuge on Rue Cantegrel in the 13th arrondissement of Paris. He also constructed the Swiss Pavilion in the Cité Universitaire in Paris with 46 units of student housing from 1929 to 1933. He designed furniture to go with the building. The main salon was decorated with a montage of black and white photographs of nature. In 1948, he replaced this with a colorful mural he painted himself. In Geneva, he built the glass-walled apartment building with 45 units, the Immeuble Clarté. Between 1931 and 1945, he built an apartment building with 15 units, including an apartment and studio for himself on the 6th and 7th floors. At 24 Rue Nungesser at Colli, in the 16th arrondissement of Paris, overlooking the Bois de Boulogne. His apartment and studio are owned today by the Fondation Le Corbusier and can be visited. Villa Contemporaine, Plan Voisin, and City Reduce, 1922 through 1939. As the global Great Depression enveloped Europe, Le Corbusier devoted more and more time to his ideas for urban design and planned cities. He believed that his new, modern architectural forms would provide an organizational solution that would raise the quality of life of the working class. In 1922, he had presented his model of the Ville Contemporaine, a city of 3 million inhabitants, at the Salon d'Automne in Paris. His plan featured tall office towers surrounded by lower residential blocks in a park setting. He reported that analysis leads to such dimensions, to such a new scale, and to such the creation of an urban organism, so different from those that exist, that the mind can hardly imagine it. The Villa Contemporaine, presenting an imaginary city in an imaginary location, did not attract the attention that Le Corbusier wanted. For his next proposal, the Plan Voisin, 1925, he took a more proactive approach. He proposed to demolish a large part of central Paris and replace it with a group of 60-story cruciform office towers surrounded by parkland. The idea shocked most viewers, as it was certainly intended to do. The plan included a multi-level transportation hub that included depots for buses and trains, as well as highway intersections and an airport. Le Corbusier had the fanciful notion that commercial airliners would land between the huge skyscrapers. He segregated pedestrian circulation paths from the roadways and created an elaborate road network. Groups of lower-rise zigzag apartment blocks set back from the street were intercepted among the office towers. Le Corbusier wrote, "The center of Paris, currently threatened with death, threatened by exodus, is in reality a diamond mine. To abandon the center of Paris to its fate is to desert in face of the enemy." As no doubt Le Corbusier expected, no one hurried to implement the Plan Voisin, but he continued working on variations of the idea and recruiting followers. In 1929, he traveled to Brazil, where he gave conferences on architectural ideas. He returned with drawings of his vision for the Rio de Janeiro. He sketched serpentine multi-story apartment buildings on pylons like inhabited highways winding through the Rio de Janeiro. In 1931, he developed a visionary plan for another city, Algiers, then part of France. This plan, like his Rio de Janeiro plan, would call for the construction of an elevated viaduct of concrete carrying residential units which would run from one end of the city to the other. This plan, unlike his early Plan Voisin, was more conservative because it did not call for the destruction of the old city of Algiers. The residential housing would be over top of the old city. This plan, like his Paris plans, provoked discussion but never came to realization. In 1935, Le Corbusier made his first visit to the United States. He was asked by American journalists what he thought about New York City skyscrapers. He responded characteristically that he found them much too small. He wrote a book describing his experiences in the States, Quand les cathédrales étaient blanches, Voyage au pays des timides, when cathedrals were white, Voyage to the Land of the Timid, whose title expressed his view of the lack of boldness in American architecture. He wrote a great deal, but built very little in the 1930s. The titles of his books expressed the combined urgency and optimism of his messages. Cannons, Montatons, No Thank You, Lodging Please, 1938. and The Lyricism of Modern Times in Urbanism, 1939. In 1928, the French Minister of Labor, Louis Louchère, won the passage of French law on public housing, calling for the construction of 260,000 housing units within 5 years. Le Corbusier immediately began to design a new type of modular housing unit, which he called the Maison Louchère, which would be suitable for the project. These units were 45 square meters, 480 square feet in size, made with metal frames, and were designed to be mass-produced and then transported to the site, where they would be inserted into frameworks of steel and stone. The government insisted on stone walls to win the support of local building contractors. The standardization of apartment buildings was the essence of what Le Corbusier termed the Viollet-le-Duc, or Radiant City, in a new book published in 1935. The Radiant City was similar to his earlier contemporary city plan, Voisin, with the differences that residencies would be assigned by family size rather than by income or social position. In his 1935 book, he developed his ideas for a new kind of city where the principal functions, heavy industry, manufacturing, habitation, and commerce, would be separated into their neighborhoods, carefully planned and designed. However, before any units could be built, World War II intervened. During the war and the German occupation of France, Le Corbusier did his best to promote his architectural projects. He moved to Vichy for a time, where the collaborationist government of Marshal Philippe Pétain was located, offering his services for architectural projects, including his plan for the reconstruction of Algiers, but they were rejected. He continued writing, completing Sur les quatre routes, on the four routes, in 1941. After 1942, Le Corbusier left Vichy for Paris. He became, for a time, a technical advisor at Alexis Carrel's Eugenics Foundation, but resigned on the 20th of April in 1944. In 1943, he founded a new association of modernist architects and builders, the Esquirrel, the Assembly of Constructors for a Renewal of Architecture, but there were no projects to build. When the war ended, Le Corbusier was nearly 60 years old, and he had not had a single project realized for 10 years. He tried, without success, to obtain commissions for several of the first large reconstruction projects, but his proposals for the reconstruction of the town of Saint-Dié and La Rochelle were rejected. Still, he persisted and finally found a willing partner in Raoul Dautry, the new Minister of Reconstruction and Town Planning. Dautry agreed to fund one of his projects, the Unité Habitation de Grandeur Conforme, or housing units of standard size, with the first one to be built in Marseille, which had been heavily damaged during the war. This was his first public commission and was a breakthrough for Le Corbusier. He gave the building the name of his pre-war theoretical project, Cité-Radieux, and followed the principles that he had studied before the war, proposing a giant reinforced concrete framework into which modular apartments would fit like bottles into a bottle rack. Like the Villa Savoye, the structure was poised on concrete pylons, though because of the shortage of steel to reinforce the concrete, the pylons were more massive than usual. The building contained 337 duplex apartment modules to house a total of 1,600 people. Each module was 3 stories high and contained 2 apartments, combined, so each had 2 levels. The modules ran from one side of the building to the other, and each apartment had a small terrace at the end. They were ingeniously fitted together like pieces of a Chinese puzzle, with a corridor slotted through the space between the 2 apartments in each module. Residents had a choice of 23 different configurations for the units. Le Corbusier designed furniture, carpets, and lamps to go with the building, all purely functional. The only decoration was a choice of interior colors. The only mildly decorative features of the building were the ventilator shafts on the roof, which Le Corbusier made to look like the smokestacks of an ocean liner, a functional form that he admired. The building was designed not to be a residence, but to offer all services needed for living. On every 3rd floor, between the modules, there was a wide corridor, like an interior street, which ran the length of the building. This served as a sort of commercial street with shops, eating places, a nursery school, and recreational facilities. A running track and a small stage for the theater performances were located on the roof. The building itself was surrounded by trees and a small park. Le Corbusier wrote later that the unité de habitation concept was inspired by the visit he had made to the Florence Charter House at Galuzzo in Italy in 1907 and 1910 during his early travels. He wanted to recreate, he wrote, an ideal place for meditation and contemplation. He also learned from the monastery, he wrote, that standardization led to perfection, and that all of his life a man labors under the impulse to make the home the temple of the family. The unité de habitation marked a turning point in the career of Le Corbusier. In 1952, he was made a commander of the Légion d'honneur in a ceremony held on the roof of his new building. He had progressed from being an outsider and critic of the architectural establishment to its center as the most prominent French architect. Post-war, United Nations headquarters, 1947 through 1952. Le Corbusier made another almost identical unité de habitation in Res-les-Nantes in Loire-Atlantique department between 1948 and 1952, and three more over the following years, in Berlin, Bria and Forêt and Firminy. And he designed a factory for the company of Claude Duval in Saint-Dié in the Vosges. In the post-Second World War decades, Le Corbusier's fame moved beyond architectural and planning circles as he became one of the leading intellectual figures of the time. In 1947, Le Corbusier submitted his design for the headquarters of the United Nations, which was to be built beside the East River in New York. Instead of competition, the design was to be selected by a board of design consultants composed of leading international architects nominated by member governments, including Le Corbusier, Oscar Niemeyer of Brazil, Howard Robertson from Britain, Nikolai Basov of the Soviet Union, and 5 others from around the world. The committee was under the direction of American architect Wallace K. Harrison, who was also the architect for the Rockefeller family, which had donated the site for the building. Le Corbusier had submitted his plan for the Secretariat, called Plan 23 of the 58 submitted. In Le Corbusier's plan offices, council chambers of the General Assembly Hall were in a single block in the center of the site. He lobbied hard for his project and asked the younger Brazilian architect, Niemeyer, to support and assist him with his plan. Niemeyer, to help Le Corbusier, refused to submit his design and did not attend the meetings until the director Harrison insisted. Niemeyer then submitted his plan, Plan 32, with the office building councils, General Assembly in separate buildings. After much discussion, the committee chose Niemeyer's plan, but suggested that he collaborate with Le Corbusier on the final project. Le Corbusier urged Niemeyer to put the General Assembly Hall in the center of the site, though this would eliminate Niemeyer's plan to have a large plaza in the center. Niemeyer agreed with Le Corbusier's suggestion, and the headquarters was built, with minor modifications according to their joint plan. Religious architecture, 1950 through 63. Le Corbusier was an avowed atheist, but he also had a strong belief in the ability of architecture to create a sacred and spiritual environment. In the post-war years, he designed 2 important religious buildings, the Chapel Notre Dame du Haut at Ronchamp, 1950 through 1955, and the Convent of Sainte Marie de la Tourette, 1953 through 1960. Le Corbusier wrote later that he was greatly aided in his religious architecture by a Dominican father, Marie-Hélène Couture, who had founded a movement and review of modern religious art. Le Corbusier first visited the remote site of Ronchamp in May 1950, saw the ruins of the old chapel, and drew sketches of possible forms. He wrote afterwards, "In building this chapel, I wanted to create a place of silence, of peace, of prayer, and of interior joy. The feeling of the sacred animated our effort. Some things are sacred, others aren't, whether they're religious or not." The second major religious project undertaken by Le Corbusier was the convent of Sainte Marie de la Tourette in La Arbreselle in the Ronde department, 1953 through 1960. Once again, it was Father Couture who engaged Le Corbusier in the project. He invited Le Corbusier to visit the starkly simple and imposing 12th and 13th century Les Thoronet Abbey in Provence, and also used his memories of his useful visit to the Erna Charter House in Florence. This project involved not only a chapel, but a library, refectory, rooms for meetings and reflection, and dormitories for the nuns. For the living space, he used the same modular concept for measuring the ideal living space that he had used in the Unité de Habitation in Marseille. Height under the ceiling of 2.26 meters, 7 feet and 5 inches, and width of 1.83 meters, 6 feet 0 inches. Le Corbusier used raw concrete to construct the convent, which is placed on the side of a hill. The 3 blocks of dormitories are U, closed by the chapel, with a courtyard in the center. The convent has a flat roof and is placed on sculpted concrete pillars. Each of the residential cells has a small loggia with a concrete sunscreen looking at the countryside. The centerpiece of the convent is the chapel, a plain box of concrete, which he called his box of miracles. Unlike the highly finished facade of the Unité de Habitation, the facade of the chapel is raw, unfinished concrete. He described the building in a letter to Albert Camus in 1957. I'm taken with the idea of a box of miracles. As the name indicates, it is a rectangular box made of concrete. It doesn't have any of the traditional theatrical tricks, but the possibility, as its name suggests, to make miracles. The interior of the chapel is extremely simple. Only benches in a plain, unfinished concrete box, with light coming through a singular square in the roof and 6 small bands on the sides. The crypt beneath has intense blue, red, and yellow walls, and illumination by sunlight channeled from above. The monastery has other unusual features, including floor-to-ceiling panels of glass in the meeting rooms, window panels that fragmented the view into pieces, and a system of concrete and metal tubes like gun barrels which aimed sunlight through the colored prisms and projected it into the walls of the sacristy and to the secondary altars of the crypt on the level below. These were whimsically termed the machine guns of sacristy and the light cannons of the crypt. In 1960, Le Corbusier began a third religious building, the Church of Saint Pierre, in the new town of Fremny-Vert, where he had built a Unité de Habitation and a cultural and sports center. While he made the original design, construction did not begin until 5 years after his death, and work continued under different architects, until it was complete in 2006. The most spectacular feature of the church is the sloping concrete tower that covers the entire interior, similar to the assembly building in his complex at Chandigarh. Windows high in the tower illuminate the interior. Le Corbusier originally proposed that tiny windows also project the form of a constellation on the walls. Later architects designed the church to project the constellation Orion. Le Corbusier's largest and most ambitious project was the design of Chandigarh, the capital city of Punjab and Haryana states of India, created after India received independence in 1947. Le Corbusier was contacted in 1950 by Indian Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru and invited to propose a project. An American architect, Albert Meyer, had made a plan in 1947 for a city of 150,000 inhabitants, but the Indian government wanted a grander and more monumental city. Corbusier worked on the plan with 2 British specialists in urban design and tropical climate architecture, Maxwell Fry and Jane Drew, and with his cousin Pierre Jeanneret, who moved to India and supervised the construction until his death. Le Corbusier, as always, was rhapsodic about this project. "It will be a city of trees," he wrote, "of flowers and water, of houses as simple as those at the time of Homer, and of a few splendid edifices of the highest level of modernism, where the rules of mathematics will reign." His plan called for residential, commercial, and industrial areas, along with parks and transportation infrastructure. In the middle was the capital, a complex of 4 major government buildings: the Palace of the National Assembly, the High Court of Justice, the Palace of Secretariat of Ministers, and the Palace of the Governor. For financial and political reasons, the Palace of the Governor was dropped well into the construction of the city, throwing the final project somewhat off balance. From the beginning, Le Corbusier worked, as he reported, like a forced laborer. He dismissed the earlier American plan as faux modern and overly filled with parking spaces and roads. He intended to present what he had learned in 40 years of urban study and also to show the French government the opportunities they had missed in not choosing him to rebuild French cities after the war. His designs made use of his favorite ideas: an architectural promenade, incorporating the local landscape and the sunlight and shadows into the design, the use of the modular to give a correct human scale to each element, somewhat based on the proportions of the human body, and his favorite symbol, the open hand. The hand is open to give and to receive. He placed a monumental open hand statue in a prominent place in the design. Le Corbusier's design called for the use of raw concrete, whose surface was not smoothed or polished, and which showed the marks of the forms in which it dried. Pierre Jeanneret wrote to his cousin that he was in a continual battle with the construction workers who could not resist the urge to smooth and finish the raw concrete, particularly when important visitors were coming to the site. At one point, 1,000 workers were employed on the site of the High Court of Justice. Le Corbusier wrote to his mother, "It is an architectural symphony which surpasses all my hopes, which flashes and develops under the light in a way which is unimaginable and unforgettable. From far, from up close, it provokes astonishment, all made with raw concrete and a cement cannon. Affordable and grandiose. In all centuries, no one has seen that." The High Court of Justice, begun in 1951, and was finished in 1956. The building was radical in its design, a parallelogram topped with an inverted parasol. Along the walls, there were high concrete grills, 1.5 meters, 4 feet and 11 inches, thick, which served as sunshades. The entry featured a monumental ramp and columns that allowed the air to circulate. The pillars were originally white limestone, but in 1960s, they were repainted in bright colors, which better resisted the weather. The Secretariat, the largest building that housed the government offices, was constructed between 1952 and 1958. It has an enormous block, 250 meters, 820 feet long, and 8 levels high, served by a ramp which extends from the ground to the top level. The ramp was designed to be partly sculptural and partly practical. Since there were no modern building cranes at the time of construction, the ramp was the only way to get materials to the top of the construction site. The Secretariat had 2 features which were borrowed from his design from the Unité de Habitation in Marseille: concrete grill sunscreens over the windows and a roof terrace. The most important building of the capital's complex was the Palace of Assembly, 1952 through 61, which faced the High Court at the other end of the 500-meter esplanade, with a large reflecting pool in the front. This building features a central courtyard, over which is the main meeting hall for the assembly. On the roof, on the rear of the building, is a signature feature of Le Corbusier, a large tower, similar in form to the smokestack of a ship or the ventilation tower of a heating plant. Le Corbusier added touches of color and texture with an immense tapestry in the meeting hall and a large gateway decorated with enamel. He wrote of this building, "A palace magnificent in its effect, from the new art of raw concrete. It is magnificent and terrible. Terrible meaning that there is nothing cold about it to the eyes." Later life and work, 1955 through 1965. The 1950s and 1960s were a difficult period for Le Corbusier's life. His wife Yvonne died in 1957, and his mother, to whom he was closely attached, died in 1960. He remained active in a wide variety of fields. In 1955, he published the Poème de langue droite, a portfolio of lithographs, published in the same collection as the book Jazz by Henri Matisse. In 1958, he collaborated with the composer Edgar Varese on a work called La Pomme Électronique, a show of sound and light, for the Philips Pavilion at the International Exposition in Brussels. In 1960, he published a new book, L'Atelier de la Recherche Patiente, the Workshop of Patient Research, simultaneously published in 4 languages. He received growing recognition for his pioneering work in modernist architecture. In 1959, a successful international campaign was launched to have his Villa Savoy, threatened with demolition, declared a historic monument. It was the first time that a work by a living architect had received this distinction. In 1962, in the same year as the dedication of the Palace of the Assemblymen of the Assembly of Chandigarh, The first retrospective exhibit of his work was held at the National Museum of Modern Arts in Paris in 1964. In a ceremony held at his atelier on Rue de Sèvres, he was awarded the Grand Cross of the Legion d'Honneur by the Culture Minister, André Malraux. His later architectural work was extremely varied and often based on designs of earlier projects. In 1952 through 1958, he designed a series of tiny holiday cabins, 2.26 by 2.26 by 2.26 meters, 7.4 by 7.4 by 8.5 feet in size, for a site next to the Mediterranean at the Roquebrune Cap Martin. He built a similar cabin for himself, but the rest of the project was not realized until after his death. From 1953 to 1957, he designed the Maison de Bruxelles, a residential building for Brazilian students for the Cité Universitaire in Paris. Between 1954 and 1959, he built the National Museum of Western Art in Tokyo. His housing projects included a cultural center and stadium for the town of Firminy, where he had built his first housing project, 1955 through 1958, and a stadium in Baghdad, Iraq, much altered since its construction. He also constructed 3 new unités de habitation in apartment blocks on the model of the original Marseille, the first in Berlin, 1956 through 1958, the second in Brie and Forêt in Meurthe et Moselle department, and the third, 1959 through 1967, in Firminy. From 1960 to 1963, he built his only building in the United States, the Carpenter Center for Visual Arts in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Jorn Utzon, the architect of the Sydney Opera House, commissioned Le Corbusier to create furnishings for the nascent opera house. Le Corbusier designed a tapestry, the Des Saints-Jets, which was completed in 1960. Le Corbusier died of a heart attack at age 77 in 1965 after swimming in the French Riviera. At the time of his death, several projects were on the drawing board. The Church of St. Pierre in Firminy, finally completed in modified form in 2006. A Palace of Congresses for Strasbourg, 1962 through 65, and a hospital in Venice, 1961 through 1965, which he never built. Le Corbusier designed an art gallery beside the lake in Zurich for gallery owner Heidi Weber in 1962 through 1967. Now called the Centre Le Corbusier, it is one of his last finished works. Estate. The Foundation Le Corbusier, FLC, functions as his official estate. The U.S. copyright representative for the Foundation Le Corbusier is the Artists' Rights Society. Ideas. The 5 points of a modern architecture. Le Corbusier defined the principles of his new architecture, Les 5 Points de l'Architecture Moderne, published in 1927, and co-authored by his cousin Pierre Jeanneret. They summarized lessons he had learned in the previous years, which he put literally into concrete form in his villas constructed in the late 1920s, most dramatically in the Villa Savoy. The 5 points are the pilotis, or pylon. The building is raised on reinforced concrete pylons, which allows for free circulation on the ground level and eliminates the dark and damp parts of the house. The roof terrace. The sloping roof is replaced by a flat roof. The roof can be used as a garden, for promenades, for sports, or a swimming pool. The free plan. Load-bearing walls are replaced by steel or reinforced concrete columns, so the interior can be freely designed, and the interior walls can be put anywhere or left out entirely. The structure of the building is not visible from the outside. The ribbon window. Since the walls do not support the house, the windows can run the entire length of the house, so all rooms can get equal light. The free facade. Since the building is supported by columns in the interior, the facade can be lighter and more open or made entirely of glass. There is no need for lintels or other structures around the window. Architectural promenade. The architectural promenade was another idea dear to Le Corbusier, which he particularly put into play in his design of Villa Savoy. In 1928, the Une Maison, un Palais, he described it. Arab architecture gives us a precious lesson. It is best appreciated in walking, on foot. It is in walking and going from one place to another that you see develop the features of the architecture. In this house, Villa Savoye, you find a veritable architectural promenade, offering constantly varying aspects, unexpected, sometimes astonishing. The promenade at Villa Savoye, Le Corbusier wrote, both in the interior of the house and on the roof terrace, often erased the traditional difference between the inside and the outside. Viollet-le-Duc and urbanism. In the 1930s, Le Corbusier expanded and reformulated his ideas on urbanism, eventually publishing them in La Viollet-le-Duc, The Radiant City, in 1935. Perhaps the most significant difference between the contemporary city and the Radiant City is that the latter abandoned the class-based stratification of former. Housing was now assigned according to family size, not economic position. Some have read dark overtones into the Radiant City from the astonishingly beautiful assemblage of buildings that was Stockholm, for example. Le Corbusier saw only frightening chaos and saddening monotony. He dreamed of cleaning and purging the city, bringing a calm and powerful architecture, referring to steel plate glass and reinforced concrete. Although Le Corbusier's designs for Stockholm did not succeed, later architects took his ideas and partly destroyed the city with them. Le Corbusier hoped that politically minded industrialists in France would lead the way with their efficient Taylorist and Fordist strategies adopted from American industrial models to reorganize society. As Norma Evenson has put it, the proposed city appeared to some as an audacious and compelling vision of a brave new world, and to others, a frigid, megalomaniacally scaled negotiation of the familiar urban ambient. Le Corbusier, his ideas, his urban planning, and his architecture are viewed separately, Perelman noted, whereas they are the same thing. In La Viollet-le-Duc, he conceived an essentially apolitical society, in which the bureaucracy of economic administration effectively replaces the state. Le Corbusier was heavily indebted to the thought of the 19th century French utopians Saint-Simon and Charles Fourier. There is a noteworthy resemblance between the concept of the United and Fourier's phalanstary. From Fourier, Le Corbusier adopted, at least in part, his notion of administrative rather than political government. The modulor was a standard model of the human form which Le Corbusier devised to determine the correct amount of living space needed for residents in his buildings. It was also his rather original way of dealing with differences between the metric system and the British or American system, since the modulor was not attached to either one. Le Corbusier explicitly used the golden ratio in his modular system for the scale of architectural proportions. He saw the system as a continuation of the long tradition of Vitruvius, Leonardo da Vinci's Vitruvius Man, the work of Leon Battista Alberti, and others who use the proportions of the human body to improve the appearance and functionality of architecture. In addition to the golden ratio, Le Corbusier based the system on human measurements, Fibonacci numbers, and the double unit. Most scholars see the modulor as a humanistic expression, but it is also argued that it's exactly the opposite. It's the mathematization of the body, the standardization of the body, the rationalization of the body. He took Leonardo's suggestion of the golden ratio in human proportions to an extreme. He sectioned his model human body's height at the navel with the two other sections in golden ratio, then subdivided those sections in golden ratio at the knee and throat. He used these golden ratio proportions for the modular system. Le Corbusier's 1927 Villa Stein and Gars exemplified the modular system's application. The villa's rectangular ground plan, elevation, and inner structure closely approximate golden rectangles. Le Corbusier placed systems of harmony and proportion at the center of his design philosophy, and his faith in the mathematical order of the universe was closely bound to the golden section of the Fibonacci series, which he described as rhythms apparent to the eye and clear in their relations with one another. And these rhythms are at the very root of human activity. They resound in man by an organic inevitability, the same fine inevitability which causes the tracing out of the golden section by children, old men, savages, and the learned. Open hand. The open hand, la main ouverte, is a recurring motif in Le Corbusier's architecture, a sign for him of peace and reconciliation. It is open to give and open to receive. The largest of the many open hand sculptures that Le Corbusier created is a 26-meter high, 85-foot version in Chandigarh, India, known as the Open Hand Monument. Furniture. Le Corbusier was an eloquent critic of the finely crafted, handmade furniture made with rare and exotic woods, inlays, and carvings, presented at the 1925 Exposition of Decorative Arts. Following his usual method, Le Corbusier wrote a book with his theories of furniture, complete with memorable slogans. In his 1925 book, L'Art décoratif d'Arge, he called for furniture that used inexpensive materials and could be mass-produced. Le Corbusier described 3 different furniture types: type needs, type furniture, and human limb objects. He defined human limb objects as extensions of our limbs and adapted to human functions that are type needs and type function. Therefore, type objects and type furniture. Certainly, works of art are tools, beautiful tools. And long live the good taste manifested by choice, subtlety, proportion, and harmony. He further declared, chairs are architecture, sofas are bourgeois. Le Corbusier first relied on ready-made furniture from Tonnet to furnish his projects, such as his pavilion at the 1925 exposition. In 1928, following the publication of his theories, he began experimenting with furniture design. In 1928, he invited the architect Charlotte Perriand to join his studio as a furniture designer. His cousin Pierre Jeanneret also collaborated on many of the designs. For the manufacture of his furniture, he turned to the German firm Gebr. Tonnet, which had begun making chairs with tubular steel, a material originally used for bicycles, in the early 1920s. Le Corbusier admired the design of Marcel Breuer and the Bauhaus, who in 1925 had begun making sleek, modern, tubular club chairs. Mies van der Rohe had begun making his version in a sculptural curve form with a cane seat in 1927. The first results of the collaboration between Le Corbusier and Perriand were 3 types of chairs made with chrome-plated tubular steel frames. The LC4, Chaise Lounge, with a covering of cowhide, which gave it a touch of exoticism. The Fauteuil Grand Confort, a club chair with a tubular frame which resembled the comfortable Art Deco club chairs that became popular in the 1920s. And the Fauteuil Dossier Vasculaire, a low seat suspended into a tubular steel frame, also with cowhide upholstery. These chairs were designed specifically for 2 of his projects, Maison La Roche in Paris and a pavilion for Barbara and Henry Church. All 3 clearly showed the influence of Mies van der Rohe and Marcel Breuer. The line of furniture was expanded with additional designs for Le Corbusier's 1929 Salon d'Automne installation, equipment for home. Despite the intention of Le Corbusier that his furniture should be inexpensive and mass-produced, his pieces were originally costly to make and were not mass-produced until many years later when he was famous. Controversies. There is debate over the apparently variable or contradictory nature of Le Corbusier's political views. In the 1920s, he co-founded and contributed articles about urbanism to the fascist journals Plans, Prelude, L'Homme est Réel. He also penned pieces in favor of Nazi anti-Semitism for those journals as well as hateful editorials. Between 1925 and 1928, Le Corbusier had connections of La Fascio, a short-lived French fascist party led by Georges Valois. Valois later became an anti-fascist. Criticism. In his eulogy to Le Corbusier at the memorial ceremony for the architect in the courtyard of Louvre on 1st of September 1965, French Culture Minister André Malraux declared Le Corbusier had some great rivals, but none of them had the same significance in the revolution of architecture because none bore insults so patiently and for so long. Later criticism of Le Corbusier was directed at his ideas on urban planning. In 1998, the architectural historian Witold Rybczynski wrote in Time magazine, he called it the Viollet-le-Duc, the Radiant City. Despite the poetic title, his urban vision was authoritarian, inflexible, and simplistic. Wherever it was tried, in Chandigarh by Le Corbusier himself or Brasilia by his followers, it failed. Standardization proved inhuman and disorienting. The open spaces were inhospitable, the bureaucratically imposed plan was socially destructive.
In the US, the Radiant City took the form of vast urban renewal schemes and regimented public housing projects that damaged the urban fabric beyond repair. Today, these mega projects are now being dismantled as superblocks give way to rows of houses fronting streets and sidewalks. Downtowns have discovered that combining, not separating, different activities is the key to success. So is the presence of lively residential neighborhoods, old as well as new. Cities have learned that preserving history makes more sense than starting from zero. It has been an expensive lesson, not one that Le Corbusier intended, but it too is part of his legacy. Technological historian and architectural critic Louis Mumford wrote in yesterday's City of Tomorrow that the extravagant heights of Le Corbusier's skyscrapers had no reason for existence apart from the fact that they had become technological possibilities. The open spaces in central areas had no reason for existence either. Mumford wrote, since on the scale he imagined, there was no motive during the business day for pedestrian circulation in the office quarter. By mating utilitarian and financial image of the skyscraper city to the romantic image of the organic environment, Le Corbusier had produced a sterile hybrid. The public housing projects influenced by his ideas have been criticized for isolating poor communities in monolithic high-rises and breaking the social ties integral to a community's development. One of his most influential detractors has been Jane Jacobs, who delivered a scathing critique of Le Corbusier's urban design theories in her seminal work, The Death and Life of Great American Cities. For some critics, the urbanism of Le Corbusier was a model for a fascist state. These critics cited Le Corbusier himself when he wrote that not all citizens could become leaders. The technocratic elite, the industrialists, the financiers, engineers, and artists would be located in the city center, while the workers would be removed to the fringes of the city. Alessandro Hsu Bruni wrote in Le Corbusier's Fatal Flaws a critique of modernism that, in addition to setting the stage for infrastructural developments to come, Le Corbusier's blueprints and models, while not so well regarded by urban planners and street dwellers alike, also examined the sociological side of cities in great detail. World War II left millions dead and transformed the urban landscape throughout much of Europe, from England to the Soviet Union, and housing on a mass scale was necessary. Le Corbusier personally took this as a challenge to accommodate the masses on an unprecedented scale. This mission statement manifested itself in the form of Cité Radieuse, the Radiant City, located in Marseille, France. The construction of this utopian sanctuary was dependent on destruction of traditional neighborhoods. He showed no regard for French cultural heritage and tradition. Entire neighborhoods were ravaged to make way for these dense, uniform concrete blocks. If he had his way, Paris's elite Marais community would have been destroyed. In addition, the scheme of segregation that plagued earlier models of Le Corbusier's continued in this supposed utopian vision, with the wealthy elite being the only to access the luxuries of modernism. Influence. Le Corbusier was concerned about problems he saw in industrial cities at the turn of the 20th century. He thought industrial housing techniques led to crowding, dirtiness, and a lack of moral landscape. He was the leader of the modernist movement to create better living conditions and a better society through housing. Ebenezer Howard's Garden Cities of Tomorrow heavily influenced Le Corbusier and his contemporaries. Le Corbusier revolutionized urban planning and was a founding member of the Congrès International, the Architecture Moderne. One of the first to realize how the automobile would change human society, Le Corbusier conceived the city of the future with large apartment buildings isolated in a park-like setting on Pelotas. Le Corbusier's plans were adopted by builders of public housing in Europe and the United States. In Great Britain, urban planners turned to Le Corbusier's Cities in the Sky as a cheaper method of building public housing from the late 1950s. Le Corbusier criticized any effort at ornamentation of the buildings. Foundation Le Corbusier. The Foundation Le Corbusier is a private foundation and archive honoring the work of Le Corbusier. It operates Maison La Roche, a museum, Located in the 16th arrondissement at 8 to 10 Square du Blanche, Paris, France, which is open daily except for Sunday. The foundation was established in 1968. It now owns Maison La Roche and Maison Jeanneret, which formed the foundation's headquarters, as well as the apartment occupied by Le Corbusier from 1933 to 1965 at Rue Nungesser at Colli in Paris, 16E, and the small house he built for his parents in Cross Row on the shores of Lac Leman. Maison La Roche and Maison Jeanneret, also known as the La Roche Jeanneret House, is a pair of semi-detached houses that was Le Corbusier's third commission in Paris. They are laid out at right angles to each other with iron, concrete, and blank white facades, setting off a curved two-story gallery space. Maison La Roche is now a museum containing about 8,000 original drawings, studies, and plans by Le Corbusier, in collaboration with Pierre Jeanneret from 1922 to 1940, as well as about 450 of his paintings, about 30 enamels, about 30 other works on paper, and a sizable collection of written and photographic archives. It describes itself as the world's largest collection of Le Corbusier drawings, studies, and plans. This has been Designwiki. I'm shocked if you made it this far throughout the video. Thanks for listening to me talk for 2 hours, and I hope to catch you in the next one. Thanks for hanging around. Goodbye.